Welcome to Autism Confidential, the podcast from the National Council on Severe Autism, where we take a hard look at many of the most pressing issues in autism today. For example, policy, research, diagnosis, education, housing, adult services, treatment, family stories, and much more. You can find us at autismconfidential.org. Now, on to our show. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Autism Confidential, the podcast from National Council on Severe Autism. I am your host today, Jill Escher. I'm president of NCSA. This episode is very special because we have as a guest one of my very, 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 very favorite people in the entire world of autism. Now, if you were to create an encyclopedia of about the history of autism research and what's going on, really around the world across dozens and dozens of different fields of autism research, that encyclopedia would be my guest today, Alycia Halladay, PhD, who is the Chief Science Officer of Autism Science Foundation, which is based in New York. Alycia comes to us today via Zoom from New Jersey. Hi, Alycia.
Hi, it is such a pleasure to be here today, and you were far too kind in your introduction.
My little encyclopedia. Well, I've been on your podcast. One thing I do want to say is Alycia is a prolific podcaster. It's called the Autism Science Foundation podcast. You can find it if you are interested in autism research. Really, it's a pleasure to hear her amazing ability to summarize a lot of complex research week after week after week. Really just a rare treasure in the autism world. Now, I also want to say something else about Alycia. Before she was at Autism Science Foundation, she was working for years at other autism nonprofits, principally Autism Speaks, where she was on the research team. And before that, National Association for Autism Research, if I got that right.
Close, National Alliance, but they merged with Autism Speaks, so it's all the same.
And then, even after she started working in the autism research field, she had twin daughters, one of whom who turned out to
be on the autism spectrum.
On the autism spectrum.
And so, she definitely has her unique qualities, and she's very different from I will be open and honest, is that she is not on the profound end of the spectrum. She is in mainstream school. She has an aide. She's, quirky. She definitely has a lot of challenges, but she also has a lot of things that make her not profound.
Well, as we know, autism is a big spectrum, and although we are the National Council on Severe Autism, we obviously respect and recognize everybody on all parts of the spectrum. So,
and I just want to say that as a parent of someone who isn't severely affected, I completely support and endorse the term either severe or profound. I completely support the idea that there are differences across the spectrum and different groups need to emerge, because if you look at my experience, if it was jaded in any way by individuals who didn't think her features were severe enough, I think that calls for a better stratification of the different types of autism.
Well, that's one of the topics I really wanted to talk about today, because that's definitely a very hot topic now in the wake of the Lancet Commission report. But let's put that on the shelf for just a second. And let's go into this. And I think what I really want to focus on today is this sense, and I think that this labeling issue is part of it, that autism research has really failed to make meaningful progress in terms of improving the lives of people and families living with autism today. I want to say, just as the president of this organization who's talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families, there really is an overwhelming feeling that despite all the money that's been poured into autism research, that so little of it is resulting in actual benefit for patients and their families. And I can't say, I disagree. I mean, you can, I think there's been some improvement in early diagnosis, but there hasn't been improvement in terms of outcomes. There hasn't been improvement in terms of treatments, whether those are medical treatments, even behavioral treatments are pretty much the same. There hasn't been improvement in terms of adult services, lifespan supports. There isn't really anything in terms of prevention. We've learned almost nothing about causation, except for, some rare genetic mutations. I think there's immense frustration, Alycia, and you've had this front row seat to research for so long. And I really want to know your perspective. What do you say to these families who said, millions and millions and millions of dollars and so little to show for it?
I completely understand your perspective and their perspective, and I see it, and I understand it, and in many ways I agree with it, because it is going very slowly. It's going a lot more slowly than scientists, I guess I'll speak for scientists, had anticipated 20 to 30 years ago. 20 to 30 years ago, the idea was that there was this one particular phenotype of autism, that there was one cause, that there was one gene, that there was going to be a treatment, that there was going to be a support system. And as kind of the onion, I guess, kind of is unpeeling, we're learning that things are immensely more complex than had been originally thought of as autism 20 to 30 years ago. I completely see how parents who have been waiting for research outcomes for the past 20 to 30 years are like, when are they going to come? When are they going to come? I think that if you, and I understand that, and trust me, I'm sympathetic to that, because I do actually sometimes read the science and think, yeah, I know. Yeah, that, so, that, yes, we knew that already. But I also think that sometimes it's helpful to even go a little bit further back and look at, instead of the past 20 to 30 years, which I know feel like they have been stagnant, but even further back, that there have been improvements in the lives of families with autism. That in fact, there are behavioral therapies that existed now that didn't exist 20 to 30 to 40 years ago, that there are supports and laws that help families with disabilities get their child an education, that allow for free and appropriate education, that we know now more about the etiologies or the causes of autism. And I know that I can tell you from a parent perspective, it's very frustrating. I know it. I feel it. I feel it from other people, and I experience it even scientifically. But unfortunately, the things that we know now to be true are true. It's not a hypothesis. It's not an idea. We know that there's not just one kind of autism. We know that there's not one cause of autism. We know that there's not a one-size-fits-all supports and services strategy, which it took all these years to kind of actually define. And I know we're going to talk about the Lancet, but I think the Lancet article really does kind of encapsulate and provide guidance for, how do we handle all of these complex questions around understanding and then helping those on the autism spectrum. So, I completely agree. And, we could talk about particular examples where I think science, you're right, early intervention, early detection, the early signs, screening has made enormous strides. Genetics has made enormous discoveries and fantastic discoveries, but we're still struggling in many, many different ways. And so I hear you and I understand you.
Yeah, I mean, I look at my two kids with nonverbal autism, and I think, I have nothing more to offer them now than I did, when they were born, 23 years ago, 16 years ago. Nothing in terms of understanding what caused it with them, right? I mean, how could it be? We're in 2022. I have 2 kids with severe nonverbal autism, and there's not a single person on the entire planet who can tell me what caused it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're genetically negative, as are 90% of autism cases. So what is it? I mean, I find it just astonishing that we haven't made more progress. But I digress. Let's go to the Lancet for a minute. Now, I think a lot of our listeners might not know what that report was. There were some many significant things about this report that came out last year. Can you do a brief overview, and then we'll talk about the labeling issue?
So this was the culmination of years and years of work between clinicians, physicians across the world, along with stakeholders, parents, people with autism from different races, ethnicities, from places like Asia and Africa, and of course, Europe and Canada and the United States. And the goal was to think about, okay, here we are in this predicament where there are many different presentations of autism, where you have everything from people who are verbally fluent and awkward and socially awkward, but could potentially live independently, to people who are going to require 24/7 care, who's in fact, their quality of life indicators are vastly different. Someone who's employed versus someone who may need supported employment. How do we serve that diverse of a group with the diverse healthcare systems across the world? So we have families in the United States, and although our healthcare system is far from perfect, who have access, at least there are psychiatrists in the United States and other places, to Africa and Asia, where there may be one autism clinician in the entire country, or there may be such terrible stigma that it makes it almost prohibitive to go out and receive services and supports. Mm-hmm. So the group got together and was working on solution-based. So should there be different labels for different types of features along the autism spectrum? And what do you do? How do you help families where they are? So whether you live in Nigeria, whether you live in the United States, whether you have health insurance, whether you don't, whether you are a working mother who cannot manage a parent implemented intervention, you're a single parent, or whether you are a stay-at-home mother. I mean, whatever your situation is, what can be the right services and supports? And so that was what the report is. And it's really hopefully a blueprint for future research priorities.
Right. It was very, very pragmatic in orientation, really saying, like, instead of talking about, basic research looking for like one more ultra rare gene, it really focused on the question of what are we going to do to improve the outcomes mm-hmm. for people today. But it did have this section about labels. Mm-hmm. And in particular, it suggested the use, not as a diagnostic, but sort of as an administrative term, the use of this term profound autism. And as I recall, the report said the term could be used, as I said, for administrative purposes, for service provision and education, in how we subgroup people in research studies, for example. What do you, obviously you said you support, right, the introduction of new specifiers, right, within autism. What do you see happening with this term profound?
So I don't know. So there could be many different things. I guess it's not that I don't know. It's that, there could be many different avenues. The DSM-5 had these kind of clinical specifiers kind of on the back end. So you got into diagnosis of autism, and then it could say with intellectual disability, minimally verbal. It could have a comorbid genetic diagnosis. There could be, extreme anxiety or other things on the back end. People were interpreting them differently in terms of what their supports would be. And also they're not being used that consistently. So,
and level 1, 2, and 3 are those considered specifiers as well, or
those are also levels of severity? So you could see how all
you would do
this,
both.
okay. You could do both. Yeah. And so sometimes they're hard to understand. People aren't using them, and listen, I'm not criticizing anybody, but it may be that we need to start with a group of individuals whose needs are so dramatically different from that group. And it turns out to be about 33% of individuals have a cognitive ability lower than 50 or have a minimal verbal ability. And these things will make it so that they will require substantial supports throughout their lifetime. In fact, what they see as a successful outcome in their lives is much different than those who have more of a typical IQ or who have some verbal ability. This is one potential way to kind of that this group looked at and agreed to say, this is how we're going to look at this group. And in fact, there are biological reasons, different neurobiology, and different even issues around what their perspective of what makes them happy or what their quality of life is, that kind of pull this group apart. And so it may not actually end up being the final, definition when you think about all the definitions of autism, but it's a start, because these are individuals that will require substantial support for their entire life. And it could be different types of support, but they're going to require different levels of support.
Yeah, just looking at the report, I'm just pulling out the main points about what characterizes profound autism. They require 24-hour access to an adult who can care for them if concerns arise. They are unable to be left completely alone in a residence. They cannot take care of daily adaptive needs. So far, those are my two kids. In most, but not all cases, their needs are associated with substantial intellectual disability. As you just said, IQ below 50, although intellectual disability starts at IQ of 70, right?
It does. So, for the purposes of this label, it was an IQ less than 50.
Yeah, I wonder why they went that low.
I think because there is this area around 70 that's called the borderline. And there are individuals who have borderline IQ that, in fact, and I have friends who have borderline IQ, and in fact, they kind of are able to live independently. They are verbal. They have some sort of employment. They obviously have supports, but they don't require 24/7 care, or they don't require, someone to live with them or provide, substantial supports in the same way that those with an IQ below 50 do. And I think that, in fact, the researchers on this paper actually put together a bunch of data sets and found that the IQ of 50 was really the appropriate cutoff. Now, I'm not saying that now and forever, this is going to be the two factors that make up this label. And of course, things are ever changing. But for now, it fits to have a group that is distinguished this way for a lot of different reasons.
Okay. And then just to finish off how the Lancet characterizes profound autism, they have very limited language, e.g. limited ability to communicate to a stranger using comprehensible sentences. Profound autism can be associated with complex co-occurring difficulties, including self-injury, aggression, and epilepsy, but is not defined by these factors. It's like my daughter, for example, who doesn't have severe behaviors, right? She would be profoundly autistic, but without, the aggression and, injury that my son, for example, has. So yeah, these are people who are neurodevelopmentally quite profoundly affected. I've been talking to a lot of researchers as part of some outreach we've been doing at NCSA. And I want to say the researchers are very enthusiastic about the term profound autism, at least the ones we spoke to. And they're enthusiastic about any kind of subgrouping. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what they've been telling me, that they feel that a lot of autism research today is kind of invalid because it lumps together so many people with such heterogeneous presentations and probably heterogeneous causes. underlying biology. And, the output of this research is very hard to interpret as a consequence because you don't have kind of a homogeneous group that's being studied. And then, of course, there's the research that shows that people with severe and profound autism are generally not even included in autism research, right? So we need much more of a focus on this group, both in terms of causation, in terms of treatment, right? And in terms of underlying biology, all of it. What is your feeling about how this sort of autism spectrum notion has maybe betrayed the real purposes of research?
I agree with the researchers that you talk to that, in fact, it's difficult for me, when I do my podcast to sometimes make any meaningful meaningful recommendations, because they have individuals in a study who range anywhere from the ages of 11 to 40 and have some of them are in mainstream education, some of them are in special education, some of their, so there's just such a diversity where if you look at an intervention, it's not going to work the same in every person. And so I'm not saying this is the cause of every intervention failing, because there's many, but it would be impossible to see an intervention, a support work in everyone, because it's not needed for some people, but it's drastically needed for others. We're seeing this with gastrointestinal problems. Some people have more severe gastrointestinal problems than others. Well, of course, if you don't have a gastrointestinal problem, you don't need an intervention for a gastrointestinal issue in autism. So, I think breaking down different groups, and I'm not saying that I alone am the one that makes the distinction about what the groups are. Some people have proposed medical comorbidities as being a group. Some people have talked about IQ and minimal verbal ability as being a group, like profound. But the way that things are right now, or have been, I should say, have been kind of grouping everybody together. So how on earth would you expect to understand the causation in one group when they're all grouped together? Clearly, people are different across the spectrum, and we should embrace that. But at the same time, from a scientific perspective, it's not doing anyone any favors, unfortunately, to scientifically look at them all as just having autism. The goal of the DSM was to say everybody's using the existing Asperger's, PDD, NOS, autism. They were all using it differently. So we kind of got rid of those subgroups. Do we need to go back again and rethink those subgroups? I think is the question going forward.
And certainly NCSA has advocated for creating DSM subgroups that are more meaningful, right, than level 1, 2, 3, currently in the DSM-5.
Yeah, and these things are ever changing. I mean, not that people should say, oh, well, it's just this version of the DSM-5. I'll wait till the next one comes out. Well, don't do that, because you need services and supports now, and you need it based on the best evidence that we have now. And so, yeah, I mean, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for how you diagnose, psychiatric issues, does change. I personally believe there should be, and there probably will be in a future edition, a video game addiction component to the DSM-5 that we didn't have 30 years ago, because video games weren't that much of an issue. So society changes, our perception of psychiatric issues changes, things emerge, and it's time for us to kind of rethink what the current paradigm is. And I think that's why so many families, including myself, are so frustrated with research, is that for many, many years, ages were lumped together, different types of autism were lumped together, genetic etiologies were lumped together, and it wasn't providing any meaningful findings. And I think that was it's a learning curve. I don't want to say it's a flaw, because that would mean that the investigators knew at the time that they were doing something wrong, when in fact that was the dogma. We're learning things, that things are changing, and we're testing them and then retesting them and turning them into scientific fact.
Let's turn now to talk about some specific issues. I just interviewed Dr. Zaharadny at Rutgers about increasing prevalence in New Jersey. Prevalence has been one of the most controversial topics in autism research. for the life of me, I don't know why it's controversial, because all I see is overwhelming evidence of dramatically increasing prevalence over the past 30 years. For example, Dr. Zaharodny talked about finding a 0.6% prevalence in South New Jersey when he first started doing this research. Now, when he looks at metropolitan areas of New Jersey, including South New Jersey, he finds prevalence between about 5 and 7%.
Mm-hmm.
He says, these aren't modest, they aren't subtle increases. These are dramatic increases that have never, finding numbers that have never been seen before. And in California, we talked about on the podcast as well, we see a very similar pattern. And this is, in California's data, is just restricted to more severe forms of autism. It doesn't include, Asperger's or, people who aren't developmentally disabled by autism. So what is going on, Alycia? What is going on? How come we're at this place where there is this pervasive idea that autism's increase is not real, but it is only an artifact of, changing diagnostics? How did we get here? And what do you think about this?
I agree with you. The issue is not, is prevalence changing? Because it is. Those are numbers. It's data. The prevalence is changing. It's going up. The question is, what's causing those increases in prevalence? So why are the number of people diagnosed with autism continuing to increase? Even if you looked at kids who are 8 years old, right? So you keep the age the same, and you just follow the next cohort of 8-year-olds over and over, and the prevalence within them increases. So it's not the issue that the prevalence is increasing, it's what's causing that. And I think that, at least in my perspective, there is an ever-growing recognition that it's not just one thing. So it's not just about changing diagnosis. It's not just about better recognition. It's not just about pediatrician education. It's not just about all of these things individually. It's about a number of things working together. And I think that there's also room, and there should be room, to think about non-genetic or gene environment interactions that may be pushing this increase in prevalence. So again, I don't want people to think that the scientists aren't looking at the numbers and saying, oh, they were 1 in 50, however many years ago, like 2000, I want to say it was 2007. And now it's, 1 in 44. Those numbers aren't different. We agree those numbers are different. The issue is, why are they different? And I think that there's an ever-growing movement to say, yeah, some of it could be that we're getting better at diagnosing. It could be that there's, better awareness, but some of it could also be because of factors that we don't even know about. We haven't been able to identify them. We haven't certainly been able to quantify them. We know of several that produce a small risk. So putting them all together may also, things like immune challenges during pregnancy, taking certain drugs during pregnancy. One of the big things now is what's going to happen to all these kids whose moms who got sick with COVID, right? So if you want to look at a severe immune challenge during pregnancy, look at COVID. So moms that had severe COVID symptoms and then had kids, what is going to be the prevalence of not just autism, but other neurodevelopmental disorders? So there's a number of different environmental factors, and they can all work together.
There obviously is a long history of infections leading to abnormal brain development in the fetus. I mean, for example, we saw that with rubella infections and Zika.
And Zika, absolutely, and Zika. And so, and they've been tied to schizophrenia. So but again, with autism, it's not like, okay, if you have a fever during pregnancy, you're 100% likely to have a child with autism. It provides a substantial but small increase. So it's some of this and some of this and some of this and some of this. And it's just been really hard for scientists to parse out, this is due to this, and this is due to this, and this is due to this, and this is due to this. But there is this big percentage of even if you account for increases in awareness and increases in changes in diagnosis and all of those other societal or maybe, diagnostic factors and all the efforts that's been going into, learn the signs to act early and outreach to pediatricians, there's still this unknown block. And so I think we need to focus, continue our work in better identifying people with autism, don't stop, but also work on that unknown block as well to figure out what's going on.
I definitely have my money on gene environment, as you know.
I do too.
I wish there was a lot more focus and research on that and a lot less on gene hunting. Can we talk about genetics for a second? I'm I'm known as a critic of, genetic research in autism. Not that I don't think it's important. Obviously, I have many friends whose kids' autism were caused by rare mutations. And we know that at least 10% of cases, maybe up to 20%, not yet proven, are caused by rare, usually de novo mutations. De novo means that these are new mutations found in the child that weren't found in the parent.
Right.
So it's not something ancestrally handed down.
Right.
Historically, we've put a huge amount of money and emphasis on genetic research in autism. I talk to genetic researchers all the time, and they admit to me their frustration. They say to me, the studies we've been doing for the last 5 years have not really revealed very much of any significance. They're finding, things of variants of very, very small effect, or that very rarely occur in the population. They're frustrated too. They assume that they would find a lot more than they have. What's your view of the future of genetic research? Do you think we should still be putting money into it? I know the Simons Foundation is the single largest private funder of autism research, and their hyper focus is genetics. What do you think? Is this money well spent? Where should we be putting our money?
So I will admit to you that I do not have a child with Phelan-McDermid syndrome, but I am on the board of the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation, which is an organization. It's a patient advocacy organization around families who have a mutation. There's different types of mutations in the SHANK3 gene. And a very, very high percentage of children and adults have with Phelan-McDermid syndrome have autism. So I want to say that I do bring the bias in that knowing about a rare genetic mutation can be life-changing for a family. So I watch this organization help families, the newly diagnosed families whose children just never developed normally, maybe had hypotonia, wasn't feeding correctly, and then they finally got a genetic test and they discovered this gene, and yes, it's a devastating diagnosis, but at the same time, they become part of this patient advocacy group and they become part of a bigger family and they work together. So I will never back away from my knowing the families and knowing the enormous impact that they have on each other and that they've had on funding and support. I won't say that it's not important, because finding these rare genetic variants can be life-changing for families. But I do think that you're right, that represents a slice of the pie. And there's a slice of the pie, in fact, where despite the ongoing best efforts of some of the best minds in the entire world, there's still this group that we think there's a genetic component, but we can't identify it. And that's incredibly frustrating. It's frustrating as a parent who has a child with autism who had a clean gene scan, right? So it is frustrating, and to not know what exactly caused it. And also to then pair it with also me thinking like, okay, well then what are some of the environmental factors involved? And so I do believe that, so first of all, I believe that even in a rare genetic form of autism, an environmental factor can have an influence. We're seeing that with families with chromosome 15. It's called Dup15q syndrome, and it's a big part of it's a critical part of chromosome 15. And if they have all sorts of different sorts of variants in different areas of this area of the chromosome, you're seeing that those families actually, that their response to environmental factors like polychlorinated biphenyls is different. So even in those rare genetic forms of autism, it leaves room for an environmental factor to have an effect. So I think that instead of thinking about, okay, well, there's rare genetic factors and then there's everybody else, and some of them can be environmentally regulated, it's okay to say that environmental factors may play an important role regardless of your genetic background. That in fact, maybe the gene, plays a bigger role than in some other people, or that it's a gene rather than smaller genes or many different smaller genes or the type of genes. But I think there's room to say that environmental factors can play a huge role regardless of your genetic background.
Well, it seems to me, though, that the search for environmental factors behind autism has almost fallen off the cliff. When you were at Autism Speaks, for example, I'm not here to bash Autism Speaks.
No,
obviously,
no.
I want to say that, but you were responsible for an environmental research portfolio, right? Autism Speaks at that time still had an interest in environmental causation. Now I look at autism advocacy groups, there's almost no interest left in how outside factors could be influencing autism risk. Autism Speaks, for example, put all of its money into genetics.
Mm-hmm.
What was the name of its
Missing
in its Missing project. And you have a group like Simon's Foundation that puts all of its money into genetics. The NIH hasn't funded interesting environmental research, in my opinion. What's happened to the interest in environmental causation? Is it so much frustration that everything that's been studied came up empty, that people have sort of thrown up their hands? What do you think?
I think it's a situation where you open up another door and then two doors open and then two more doors open. One of those things like, you never know what's happening. And it's frustration, but it's also like, we don't have, and we need to invest in the tools to study environmental factors the same way we've studied genetic factors. There isn't like a whole genome sequence for environmental factors that can capture everything. What researchers tried to do was collect water samples and air samples and dust samples and, look at different socioeconomic levels and demographics and look at all these different things. They weren't doing it at the right period in critical development. And then they were doing it in the right critical period of development. And then they didn't have all the necessary tools to analyze it, because there may be things you're exposed to that you don't even know about, or things that work together in ways that you don't even know about. And I think that science in general, and this could be NIH, this could be, any organization that funds basic science, right? That is a National Science Foundation, should invest more in some of the tools to study these things, right? Because that's how science in looking at gene environment interactions is going to move forward. It's going to be about the bioinformatics. It's going to be about the better testing. There's a study looking at, it's pretty amazing, looking at, you can take a baby tooth and look at different layers of enamel in the baby tooth to look at different periods of critical fetal development. Now, that sort of technology was not available 10 to 20 years ago. It's available now. There was one study that looked at hair and the different areas of the hair strand and could look at, what were some of the environmental toxic chemicals that looked at different areas of the hair. Those are the sorts of things that science, I think funding agencies need to focus in on, the ones with the big bucks, because it's going to take the big bucks to look at whole genome wide and whole exposome wide. So what are all of the different factors involved in the environment, and how do you integrate it with genetics? And I think that that's been the challenge. And we've been able to figure out how to, sequence the human genome for less than $2,500. So let's move and figure out how to capture all these different environmental factors and combine the two together.
Yeah, and the environmental factors, starting as I like to say, when they were sperm and egg, right? And when we say environment, just so the listeners understand, environment, we don't necessarily mean like, the things that are around you, like, the air pollution, water pollution, plasticizers. It includes things like pharmaceuticals, medical interventions, stress, trauma. It's not just things that we traditionally think of as, environment. When scientists talk about environment, they really mean almost everything that's not a gene.
Yeah. And some of these things don't have to be things that, like, it doesn't have to be measured from the air or measured from your hair. It could be self-report. It could literally be, and this is why countries like, I like to call them Norland, so Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, have been able to identify environmental factors, because instead of self-report, they have all these linked databases. So they can tell you exactly when a woman was prescribed a specific pharmaceutical, and then they can track the outcome of that pregnancy. Those sorts of techniques only exist in a few insurance databases within the United States, and certainly don't exist around the world. So, it's important to take advantage of that. And it's important that we not rely on one particular thing. I talk about a whole exome thing, like you just take a swab or you take a piece of hair and then you get the complete story. It's not going to be that simple. There's going to have to be multiple ways for that data, including the electronic medical record, a self-report, maybe a blood sample, maybe the placenta sample, maybe, like all of these other things that are important when thinking about the prenatal environment or the preconceptual environment that we need to look at. And it's not going to be so simple as a DNA swab, unfortunately. And I think that's been the challenge and will be the challenge.
So let's go to one more topic. Treatments. I think there really is immense frustration around the failure to develop treatment, and frustration, not just in the patient population, but among the scientists, the researchers, the practitioners, the clinicians, right? Everybody is frustrated, I sense, that there's been a failure to develop treatments. Now, if you talk to some researchers, they'll say, well, I really believe that there will be some translation. When they say translation, they mean moving out of basic science and into clinical, utility. There'll be some translation of this work. We will be able to find, some drugs that target, for example, some pathways, some biological pathways that are influenced by, genetic abnormalities. We haven't seen that yet in autism. What do you think is the future? Do you think there's hope for finding meaningful treatments, either for the core symptoms of autism or for, as we're doing now, all of the comorbidities around autism, the sleeplessness, the anxiety, the aggression, the seizures, obviously, there's so many things around autism that are more targetable than the autism itself. What do you see? Do you see anything in the pipeline now that could make any difference?
So this is an area that actually, I think, when people look back on the field of behavioral interventions 20 years ago, and then they look at it today, they'll realize that there has been substantial progress. And behavioral interventions are not the be all end all. In fact, people with autism are most likely on multiple types of behavioral interventions and therapies. And so it's not the only thing, but I think that that's one area where we can say, they were very rudimentary 40 years ago, and now they're getting much more targeted. They're getting more focused on child-driven activities, things that can be done in multiple environments, more generalizable, not putting somebody in front of an ABA therapist for 40 hours a week at home, but done more flexibly in different environments. Also things like, social interventions and interventions for social interactions and even repetitive behaviors. So I think that that's one kind of success in a way. But I also agree that they don't work for everyone, and they don't work the same way for everyone. And so a lot of families do turn to pharmacological interventions. And frankly, yeah, they are lacking. Right now, there are 2 approved for autism, but not the core symptoms of autism. So we're talking about impulsivity and aggression, the things you mentioned before that aren't core, but are important.
Yeah, and those 2 that are approved are risperidone and Abilify.
Yes, and Abilify. And honestly, if your child is aggressive and hyperactive, then, or hyperactive in a way that's impulsive, I guess I should say, rather than just hyperactive, these drugs can be lifesavers. And they do have their downsides, but in fact, as kids grow older and become aggressive, and impulsive, it's a lot different than when they're 3-year-olds. So, they are important. I think that there needs to be, we also don't know in terms of some of these things like anxiety and sleep and even gastrointestinal disorders and some of these other things that aren't core to the autism, but are highly prevalent in autism. We don't actually know if the drugs that treat, like, we don't know if we're giving it to them, but do Valium and Xanax and Buspirone, are they really as effective in people without autism as they are with autism? And those are commonly used drugs to treat anxiety disorders. We don't know, or there haven't been studies, or the studies are hopelessly underpowered, and which means they don't have enough families involved, or previously they've taken big lumps of people with different levels of anxiety and different types of anxiety presentation and put them together and expected them all to work the same way, and they don't. I do see with the more and more of taking specific groups of people with similar phenotypes, whether that's people with autism and severe anxiety, or people with autism and GI issues, or people with autism who have, who have verbal ability, but may have, sensory sensitivities that pretty much paralyze them. If you're taking those groups of people and comparing more like to like, you're more likely to see effects of treatments. So I think kind of dissecting out is what researchers say, dissecting out the heterogeneity of autism is going to make huge strides. But, I will be the first to agree that 2 drugs to treat autism that don't even treat the core symptoms of autism is a failure. And we should be doing better than that. And so sometimes if you're a family and you want to be involved in a clinical trial and you're not eligible, I know that that's frustrating, but that's part of trying to get better interventions for the right people. Maybe it does just work for boys. Maybe it does just work for girls. Maybe it does work for those who have verbal ability, but not those who are minimally verbal. We're seeing that as well, is that, and it's frustrating for parents. I hear this all the time, like, well, I tried to get into the study and I couldn't. Well, I know that's frustrating, but there's a reason for that. It's because we don't want to just lump everyone together and hope for the best. Is that scientists really do want to get down to the specifics of who helps what, or what helps who, sorry.
Are you optimistic that cannabis-based therapeutics could help some people with autism with some of their, anxiety, sleep, and other issues? Well, obviously seizures as well.
So
there's actually data on the seizure part.
There's data, but you know what? There needs to be more. And I have been, ASF has been very clear. We have to move marijuana off Schedule 1. It has to come down to Schedule 2, because if it's on Schedule 1, it's almost logistically impossible for scientists to study it. And Schedule 1 is the way that the DEA kind of organizes drugs of abuse into different categories. So for example, heroin is on a Schedule 1, because at some point someone decided that heroin had provided no clinical utility. Cocaine was on a Schedule 1. Now they use these different types of cocaine in certain eye surgeries. So it's been used to a Schedule 2. And so it's based on the addiction potential and then also the potential for therapeutic use. And so it had been previously thought that marijuana was not only addictive, which we could argue, but it also had no clinical utility. It couldn't help anyone with anything like pain or nausea or core symptoms of autism. And we're finding that it's kind of been taken as a state by state issue, because states can regulate it differently. But for research purposes, it's very, very hard to get access unless there's a private funder who's willing to kind of bypass that in certain states. And I think there absolutely needs to be more research. But what has to happen first is we all have to lobby for it to get off of Schedule 1 and onto a Schedule 2 so that it can be studied more freely in different environments and for different groups.
Right. I assume there must be some cannabis advocacy groups who are doing that work. Yeah.
And unfortunately, they've been considered, they've been considered the fringe groups who just want everyone to get high, when in fact, they're trying to ease regulations to make them able to be studied. And I'm not saying that cannabis is going to work for everyone either.
No.
Just like anything else. But it seems to be working for some people for certain symptoms. So why shouldn't it be able to be available for people with autism? And I hear questions from parents all the time. Okay, what strain should I smoke and then blow into the mouth of my, my 20-year-old with autism? How much of a brownie should I give? They've made homemade brownies. And unfortunately, I can't answer these things because you're basically dealing with something where there's so much variability, whatever the strain is, whatever they could get a hold of, what potency they make a brownie. And there are states like Oregon and California where it's much more available to families. But then there are other states like Wisconsin where people are having to kind of smuggle in even products that are associated that aren't psychoactive because they're banned. It's we need changes there, but I can't definitively.
I will admit here on air that my son's on 5 medications, and one of them is cannabis based. So I'm one of those Californians.
No, I mean, and that's great because you can probably say, okay, this is the strain, this is the dose. You can even get down to a brand or whatever that has been able to work for whatever. Whether that's anxiety, whether that's feeding issues, whether that's core symptoms of autism, whether that's impulsivity or aggression.
In our case, the anxiety and the aggression.
But a lot of states don't have access to that. And so they're kind of playing around with what they have available illegally. And so that's what really needs to change.
Yeah, and I also feel that families are very much experimenting on their own children because they don't have the guidance from clinicians or from research to tell them what might work or not. And some families report benefits and some really don't. As you said, it's all over the map. Well, we have to come to a close. I could talk to you all day about research, Alycia, as you know.
I know.
What happens when you put 2 geeks in a room on autism research?
You get an hour-long podcast.
But really very much appreciate your time. I will put in the show notes a link to ASF, a link to your podcast. Oh, how about also a link to your recent paper in pediatrics?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's open access now. So I worked with a number of epidemiologists, clinical scientists, public health researchers, and we outlined the reasons why scientists should continue to explore different environmental factors, including toxic chemicals in autism. We're not saying that toxic chemicals cause autism in every single person, because again, people who are exposed to high levels of air pollution and or pesticides and based on their different occupations or where they live, they don't always have a child with autism. It's not 100%. But some of these toxic chemicals are incredibly dangerous to the health and well-being of children outside even an autism diagnosis. I look at some of these things and I'm like, let's just forget about autism for a moment. Being exposed to this high level of air pollution results in asthma and neurodevelopmental disorders outside of
prematurity.
Prematurity. So, we kind of call for more research into the area and not to just dismiss it out of hand, although there have been questions in the role of some chemicals that are yes or no, but there are other chemicals or other environmental exposures where there's something of a risk. We can mitigate that. We can mitigate things like air pollution. We can mitigate phthalate exposure. We can mitigate, other things that may deplete different chemicals in the body. So there are things that can be done. We don't know if that's going to reduce risk, but we know it's going to reduce risk of other things like prematurity and asthma and things like that. And so that's kind of what we're advocating for, is continued research.
Yeah, I will definitely link to that paper. Well, with that, I thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with our audience, and for all that you've done to raise awareness about autism research, translate complex autism research for a general audience, for all you do at ASF. So, and for being an autism mom.
Well, thank you for doing this. There is certainly not enough, there are not enough. I come from an organization who, knows ASF does not try to be everything to everybody. We try to focus on the science. We don't have, like ASA has these call lines and these, chapters that help families on an individual basis. We focus on the science. And the same thing for the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. It helps families with Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. I'm completely in support of all the other organizations that help families with their own particular struggles, be it genetic or otherwise. And so
it's a big, big, big autism world.
It's a big world. And there are so many people that need help, that the more people to help them and the more organizations to help them, I'm completely in support of that.
Yeah. Well, now that we're seeing autism rates in excess of 2%, in the US, it is a bigger and bigger autism world every year. So thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in to Autism Confidential. If you'd like to learn more, share an idea for an episode, or become a sponsor, please visit us at autismconfidential.org. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual speakers. Content presented is for informational purposes only, and we do not provide any medical or legal advice.